To render hair in the Maya software renderer, there are a few considerations you'll need to make. Let's take a look at the settings to render hair in Maya software. The first thing I want to do is to play the simulation for a few frames in order to get the simulation to settle down. Now the hair at about frame 5 or 6 is now settled into its resting position. The first thing I'll do is change the Maya software renderer settings to give it a production quality preset. We'll go into the render settings window, go to the Maya software tab and set the quality to production quality. And that just gives us better anti-aliasing throughout. Let's render this. I've got 3 lights in my scene and no shadows yet, so we'll do a test render and see what it looks like without any shadows. As you can see, without shadows, the hair looks a bit overlit. We'll store that image so we can compare it to others. And let's enable shadows for the key light. I'll click in the main viewport and tap the spacebar. Go over to the top view and select this light here, which is point light 1, and that's the key light. And I want to open up the attribute editor, Control A. And in the light shape node, I want to go to the shadows section, scroll down a bit, and enable use depth map shadows. The Maya software renderer is rendering the hair as paint effect strokes. And paint effects only support depth map shadows. You cannot use ray trace shadows with paint effect strokes. So our only option here is to use depth map shadows. And I've left all the settings here at their defaults. Let's go ahead and select the camera view once again by clicking in that viewport and then click render the current frame once again. Here's what we see with the default values for the shadow maps, and it doesn't look so great. I'll go ahead and store that image and compare it to the other image by adjusting the scroll bar here. So that's with default shadow maps, and that's with no shadows at all. I want to select that light again. And we need to change some things here. The resolution is the quality, or the number of pixels in the shadow map. I'm going to turn that up to a 2K setting of 2048. Filter size is the softness. I'm going to turn that up all the way, in fact. And the bias is the distance of the shadow to the receiving surface. I'm going to leave it at the default of 0.001, and we'll do a test rendering. Click in the main camera viewport again, and click render the current frame. Having adjusted those shadow settings, we're getting a little bit better result now. And I'll go ahead and store that image so we can compare it to the others. Here it is with the adjusted shadow map settings, and that's the default settings. So you can see that the quality is much better. We're not getting this aliasing here where we have very large visible pixels. We have a higher resolution. We've also filtered it to soften it up. But we can go back into those shadow map settings and adjust the bias. And that can give us different effects here on the hair. So let's go ahead and select that light once again. And then go back into the point light shape and adjust the bias. If we increase the bias too much, then the shadow may not appear on the surface at all. And it depends upon how far away the camera is from the object, because we have these options of use mid-dist and autofocus enabled. And that's because these options here, use mid-dist and autofocus, are enabled. And they determine where a shadow will land based upon the distance to the camera. We need to leave those on, but we just need to know that camera distance is a factor here. And if the camera is a different distance, that means you may need to have a different bias value. Let's render it with a bias of 0.01. With the bias increased up to 0.01, the shadow is not even really visible. It's still there just a little bit, but hardly visible. We'll store that image. So this is with a bias value of 0.01. And this is with the default value of 0.001, and there's an order of magnitude difference there. Well, what we want here, I think, is something in between. And I experimented with this particular scene earlier, and I determined that the optimal value for this was a bias value of 0.002, which gave us a better result for the shadows, so that we were seeing, cleaner hair, and we were not seeing so much of these sort of extra shadow areas that are kind of distracting. So with a bias of 0.002, I think we hit the sweet spot for this particular rendering. And here's with our bias of 0.002, and I'll store that image. Let's compare it. That's 0.002, that's 0.01, and that's 0.001. So you can see 0.002 versus 0.001 is a big difference. I'll delete this one in the middle so that we can see this a little bit more clearly. I'll delete the one that was clearly not working. Click on delete. Okay, so the difference here is that's 0.002 and 0.001. And 002 looks cleaner to me. I'm not seeing so much sort of extra shadowing around here. So you've sort of minimized the shadow a bit, and it's brightened up the hair a little bit as well. Okay, so that's all about the shadows. The next thing I want to show you is sometimes you may get little render glitches when you render with a Maya software renderer. And I can see a stray pixel up here at the top of the character's forehead. And I'm going to zoom in on that with the mouse wheel and get in really close with Alt and middle mouse so you can see it. Now you may not notice that at first, but if you've got an animated rendering, you may actually have issues with this where pixels kind of dance around. And this actually has to do with the camera and the way that the Maya software renderer actually composites paint effect strokes with geometry. I'll set this back to a 1:1 scale, and I need to select the camera. Go over to the View menu in this camera menu here and choose View, Select Camera. And in the Camera Shape Node attributes, scroll down, go into the Output settings, and this depth type option is what's causing the issue here. What we need to do if we're rendering paint effects and geometry at the same time is set the depth type to closest visible depth. And what that means is that geometry is going to be drawn on top of the paint effect strokes. And with that setting done, we'll do another test render. Okay, so that's cleaned up that little issue there with that stray pixel. We can zoom in on that, take a real close look, and you can see that it's fine. Store that image, and then compare it to the other versions. So there it is with furthest visible depth and with closest visible depth. And you can see that it's also changed the behavior of the renderer around this transition zone between geometry and paint effect strokes. Again, the geometry is drawn on top now. So that's what we want. Cool. Okay, so there's one more thing that you might want to do for Maya software, and that is oversample the strokes. Go back into the render settings window, and in the Maya software tab, scroll all the way down to the bottom and open up Paint Effects Rendering Options. And in there, you will see a switch that says Oversample. And if you turn that on, then the renderer will internally render the strokes at double resolution and then downsample them to your current render resolution. And that's a really good thing, actually, because it will prevent a lot of aliasing and sort of crunchy rendering artifacts. Okay, we'll render that with the oversampling enabled. And here's the result with oversample. We'll store that image and compare it to the previous one. So here's with oversampling on, and there's with oversampling off. On and off. We get in really close on this, we can even see it more clearly. Oversampling makes it much softer and results in a much cleaner and much more believable rendering. And if you leave oversample off, then you may get some aliasing artifacts, especially in an animated shot. And those are the basic settings that you will want to pay attention to for rendering hair with Maya software.